Aha, it looks like it's happening. Okay, friends, both friends in the room, friends online. This is Laura May Lindo coming to you live to talk about Bill 33, what to watch for, what to do next. So I'm going to start off because I think it's really important for us to recognize that I'm hosting this live stream from land that is held down, cared for, loved, and stewarded by the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Neutral people. We are on the Haldeman Tract. And I want to offer this reflection as we talk about Bill 33. There is a long, sordid history of education being a site of harm and pain and violence in Indigenous communities, not because of Indigenous communities, but because of the reality of colonization. And sometimes when we think about Indigenous communities, we think that this all happened in the past, but we don't remember that what happened to make residential schools legal entities in this country happened in the present for the people that were watching it go through the legislative process. And so here we are looking at Bill 33, and there are a lot of concerns about what it is that the government is trying to do with Bill 33 and how the powers that are being put into the hand of a minister might be used. It doesn't matter if this particular minister uses them or doesn't. The reality is that that would now be a legal opportunity, and we have to learn from history. And so I just want to start us off in that place. I'm going to start high level with an introduction to Bill 33. It's called, I will read the exact title. It is called An Act to Amend Various Acts in Relation to Child, Youth, and Family Services, Education, and Colleges and Universities. There's three big things that we just need to understand to ground ourselves with this piece of legislation. The first is that the legislation itself is a number of amendments. It is not something new in and of itself. It's amending pieces of legislation that already exist, and it's created with three different sections. The first is Schedule 1, which looks at children's aid, and that piece of legislation is Child, Youth, and Family Services Act. The second is Schedule 2, which is for K to 12, so kindergarten to grade 12. That's the Education Act that they want to put some amendments in. And the third is Schedule 3, Post-Secondary Education, and that is the Ministry of Training, Colleges, and Universities Act. So these are the three pieces of legislation that they're trying to make some adjustments to. The second thing that's important for us to recognize is that each of those sectors are actually overseen by different ministers. But this piece of legislation, Bill 33, is only being proposed by one of the three. So for MCCSS, which oversees children's aid, that is the Honorable Michael Parsa. For colleges and universities, it's the Honorable Nolan Quinn. And for education, so kindergarten to grade 12, it's the Honorable Paul Calandra. And this piece of legislation, Bill 33, is being proposed solely by the Education Minister, Paul Calandra. For those that are watching how bills become laws, if you haven't seen the cartoon, look it up. It's hilarious. I know, it's awesome. You got to know how this stuff is made. But this piece of legislation is still in second reading. So every bill that is proposed goes through three stages. At various times, the community can get involved and provide feedback. I'll talk to you a bit about that because there's some caveats. But right now, Bill 33 is in second reading, which means when the House resumes again, they will be debating Bill 33 when the government decides to call it. So we've got to keep an eye out to know when it is that we can actually be submitting things, talking about it. There's petitions that you can sign. I'll make sure that people have access to that as well. If you're in the room, you can sign them now, if you feel so inclined. If you're not in the room, you can reach out to me. I can get you petitions if you want to sign or collect signatures, or not, because I'm not in charge of you. The third thing that I want us to understand is that because we're talking about amendments to pieces of legislation that already exists, this is actually a conversation about changing values and visions for each of these sectors. This is not a conversation about small little things that don't really matter, like what book are you going to read next week. This is a shift in the way that we're going to understand what happens in post-secondary institutions, in education, and there are changes to children's aid. For the purpose of this conversation, I'm going to be focused on Schedules 2 and 3, the impact on post-secondary education and K-12 education, and I'm going to have to reserve some time at a different about the amendments that are being proposed for children's aid. Okay. So, although I'm going to be speaking to you, and I'm sure that you have questions about post-secondary education, I need us to understand that education is it starts in early years, it goes through to grade 12, and then you end up in post-secondary, which means whatever they're proposing from K to 12 will in fact have an impact on what happens to us in post-secondary. Many of the concerns that people have raised, I think, can be like in 3 buckets. Overreach from the government, concentrated power is another big concern that folks have, and a shift of values is another concern. So I'm going to be very, very quick, but I have to talk to you about what's happening in Schedule 2, which is actually pretty interesting. Sorry? Yeah, for kindergarten to grade 12 first, because what happens there will most definitely have a ripple in what happens in post-secondary. And so on the actual slides, I talk about a couple clauses, but I'm going to actually say a couple things to you because I think it's easier for me to just speak about it, but at least you can follow along. It's just high-level things about concerns that people have had about Schedule 2. The first is that there's a request to amend subsection 8 of the Education Act, and they want to add something under Schedule 8, which is titled Powers of the Minister. So a lot of the amendments are under this heading of Powers of the Minister. The first thing that they want to add is this, and the language matters. Right now, it reads as they want to set out requirements relating to discretionary spending, or what they're trying to put in is that they want to set out requirements for related to discretionary spending for boards, which is fine, because somebody somewhere has to put parameters around how money is spent. But the language used is that they're going to require the boards to comply, and that they're going to set specific key priorities. There's no discussion about what those priorities will be, and that's why this conversation is about values that are shifting. Where those conversations happen regarding what those priorities will be, how it's set, what the parameters will be for discretionary spending will be up to the minister, because it's under the section that says powers of the minister. Why this matters, whatever grade you're in, wherever you are, whatever you think about education, is that discretionary spending is often what you use to fund things that aren't necessarily a government priority. So if the government is saying that priority is work-placed learning and getting people experiential learning so they can go and be part of a capitalist society, you can use discretionary spending to support mental health, because they didn't want to put money there, to support folks with disabilities because they didn't want to put money there, to support equity-focused work because they didn't want to put money there. And so there's some leeway as the world shifts for us to be able to spend on what's needed. If they actually make this change, then that also goes underneath the priorities of the minister, and there's no telling what could happen. Maybe it'll be awesome, maybe it'll be less awesome. Yep. So there's what that's going to look like, I don't even know anymore, because at this point, what I'm also seeing, Sia, what I'm also seeing is that some of the things that are embedded in this piece of legislation are actually already being directed by the minister through other kinds of directives. So another example, so we're going to hold that question for 1 sec, but another example of concerns that people have is the return of the school resource officer. There's a section that they want to include inside Bill 33 in Schedule 2 that requires school boards to build relationships with police services. The language isn't perhaps you will have a conversation. The language is that they are going to actually be moving in this direction. They have a section that they want to add that's called Work with Local Police Services, and it reads, every board shall work with its local police services to, in the prescribed circumstances, A, provide the local police services with access to school premises, B, permit the local police services to participate in school programs, and C, implement school resource officer programs where such programs are available. So it's not a question of we're going to explore this. It is very clearly the use of the word shall means that by law, the schools from K to 12 must. They must move in this direction. This is a problem on a variety of levels. One is that students themselves have actually said that they are not understanding or feeling comfortable or feeling safe with these programs in the school. This has happened across the province, not just in my neck of the woods. The second is that police officers themselves have said they don't know what this program is. The school resource officer program was created many, many, many years ago without clear parameters. And so different communities were doing different things with the program, and they don't necessarily know what the goal of that program is. But if we put the first set of amendments together with the second set of amendments, it's very possible that the minister will decide what those priorities are for that program, which is something that we have to consider. The school resource officer. The image is just images that I could find, but it's the school resource officer program that they're talking about. The other thing that's important to note is that in paragraph, I have to go backwards, but then I'll come back, I promise. But paragraph 30, they wanted to add something. They want to take away what is currently written. What is currently written under paragraph 30, again, this is under the powers of the minister. It says, the minister shall prescribe the duties to be performed by auditors appointed under subsection, and it names the subsections. They want to put in new language that will say, they will prescribe the duties to be performed by ministry auditors, external auditors, and internal auditors. So now language that would have allowed for an external audit to verify the work of priorities within a ministry are also under the ministry's direction. If you start to also decide the priorities external and internal, where is the independent body that will make sure that things are okay if somebody raises an issue? So the next piece of the Education Act, again, I'm still K to 12, is around school names. For anybody who is watching or in the room with me that has been following the ways that we try to, for instance, walk a path of reconciliation, pay attention to historical figures that have been put at the forefront of our school names, some of the sort of low-hanging fruit to do that work is to consider who else could we put in these role model type positions in the naming of our schools. This is one of the sections that they want to add and amend. So for school naming, they want to add this to the Education Act. The title would be school names, and underneath, they want the boards to apply to the minister before they can rename a school or name a school. So for new schools or for schools that are being renamed, they would have to apply to the minister, and it would be the minister, not community, not the ministry, but the minister themselves who would make a decision about what's approved and what's rejected. They've also made sure that if there's a name that has been used or is proposed to be used after January 1st, 2025, so that's this past January, they might actually be asked to apply to the minister to get approval. So even if they've gone through community consultation, selected a name that reflects their community, people agree on it, people are feeling like they're part of that community, the minister has the right, if and when this law becomes, or when this bill becomes law, to make them apply. And then it would be the minister's decision about whether or not that name will remain. This is for kindergarten to grade 12. I have some, for those that are on the live stream, I have folks that are in the room. I promise you I will repeat the question, so Pause. Talk amongst yourselves. Go ahead.
Just a quick question. That like it dates. Like, does that mean that anything has been approved at current to be backdated?
That's right. So if
backdated to January 1st, 2025?
Well, if it was approved by January 1st, 2025, so if it was something that had gone through consultations leading up and the decision was made in January 2025 or later, when this becomes law, the minister can go back to those schools and say, you have to apply for that name. In the interim, they have to go back to the original name. And if the minister rejects the name that they have asked for, and that community had stood by, because these are schools that would now have the new name, the minister would make them go backwards to the original name. So any of that consultation that's happened leading up is being disregarded. But that's the same parallel that you're seeing with the school resource officer. Any of the consultations that were done with young people about that program is also being rejected, whether people supported it or not, because the power of what those programs would be is now sort of being dictated internally by a single person, as opposed to with community's input.
So if the public school had a name like Ryerson or
Yes,
and they want to change that, the government would deny it.
yes. So John A. Macdonald, the names that we've typically seen, Sir John A. Macdonald, Sir Alexander Mackenzie, the Ryerson schools, all of that kind of stuff. If those names got changed from January 1st of this year to present, then it's possible. It's not required. It doesn't say that the minister is going to force them to change it back, but the power is with the minister to decide whether or not those new names will remain or a name. They haven't said what will happen if they just, let's say they reject it. What they have said is that the old name will come back. So if they moved it to something else instead of Ryerson, for instance, then that new name would go backwards. Now, this is kindergarten to grade 12. There are questions that are remaining about universities, for instance, TMU. If that name would remain TMU, if they would then take these powers, it's a different act that's being amended. But a lot of times when you amend an act that exists, you're also testing the waters of community to see what you can do and what you can push. You're pushing to see what your limits are. So there are questions about the ripple. If we allow this in K to 12 because we are focused on post-secondary, then what will happen in post-secondary? And that's part of why people have sort of put this under this umbrella of potential overreach. And what that will now look like, we don't know, right?
Each of these points in schedules, have the ministers, government officials talked about the reason why they want to introduce these changes?
So the question in the one of the questions in the room is about whether or not other people in government have had discussions about the kinds of amendments that are being put into this and why. Like, what is the rationale? So the reality in the process, at least from my humble point of view, from my time in office, is that those conversations happen during debate. So right now, this particular bill is in second reading, so debate is still happening. Even though there was a recess and a break for the summer, when they come back, somebody has to call this bill to continue the debate, and the process has to continue. There's two different places where input can come in around the why, like what is the rationale, what are the goals, right? One, it happens in debate, and it happens when opposition members ask questions as the debate is going forward. So that's literally in the chamber. Technically, the next part of the process, should it pass, which if you know numbers, it's gonna pass when they start to vote, unless something super strange happens. The current government has a whopping majority. So when they vote and it passes, the minister who's tabling the bill, so this would be the Honorable Paul Calandra, would then decide which committee it goes to. While in committee, there should be technically time where community comes in and they start to talk about the bill. That can happen in two ways. You can go to Queen's Park when they have an opportunity for community to come in and speak about it, or they'll do something called Make the Bill Travel, where they take the bill and they go to different parts of the province. Usually when there's a lot of tension, they don't want to travel the bill. I'm just saying. I think it's in there as an option because it's our democracy. We should have every bill travel so that we can all have input. What do we do with somebody who's, far north in the province who can't get there? If they're only having these consultations in person at Queen's Park. During the pandemic, there were opportunities to go virtual since the pandemic, and perhaps this has changed. But while I was still in office, they weren't allowing virtual committee meetings after the pandemic, and everybody could come back. It was in person again. So that will be one other moment where people can sort of give some feedback. At that point, let's say they do take solicit feedback from community, then that committee will decide around language and changes. So they may take into consideration what community is saying, and they may drop a schedule. Like they might say, okay, you know what, we're not, the school naming is too much. We aren't ready, in the words of Beyonce, for that jelly. So we are going to get rid of that schedule, but we'll put the other amendments through. But that debate will happen in committee. Then it would go back to the chamber for the third reading, and more debates will happen. And that might be where they would say, we decided to say no to this schedule, or we're going forward with this part, but not that part. And you'll start to see the why behind. So paying close attention, following ola.org, when they start to debate, these things are available for the public to watch. Like, let's have some watch parties. If anybody's out there that wants to have a watch party with me, like, literally, let's do it, because then we can actually be monitoring what is happening while it's actually happening in real time, right?
And other than the bill text, the government doesn't technically have to provide rationale or reasoning why they're doing this.
No. So the way the question was, does the government actually have to provide rationale? And I'm going to expand your question to anybody who tables a bill, because everybody has an opportunity at some point to table a piece of legislation who's elected and working in that chamber. And the reality is, you table your vision, and debate is where you explain your why. And so a lot of time actually goes into finding, they call them validators, which are people who would support the vision that you're presenting for the province. And so you will bring in their conversations. You might actually tell a story about somebody, whether it's in your riding or somewhere else in the province, who believes that this is a good idea. So the why behind comes out in debate. The challenge in our democratic system is that we all have different lives that we're trying to live. And so we aren't necessarily available to listen to the debate when the why happens. So instead of being in that moment where it's at least closer to form or more organic in those debates, I don't know if organic's the right way, because sometimes people have other people write their speeches, but that was my inside voice. But one of the things that makes it difficult is that then we rely on the news as the way that we're going to know about what that why is. So somebody makes a news story, and if you've done any kind of analysis of how news stories get written, the bias is sometimes inside there. So I say all of that to remind people to be critical in what it is that you're listening to, including this live stream. If you're listening to me, this is my analysis. This is based on my experiences and the kinds of concerns that I have. That doesn't mean that it's going to align with what other people say, but I want it to spark conversation. I want folks to take a look. The challenge, again, another challenge, is that when a piece of legislation is tabled and it's a bunch of amendments, if you don't know what the actual language was, you don't know what they're amending. So I did the work of going back to the Education Act and comparing the language. And that's how come my analysis is as it is. When it comes to the post-secondary section, which I'm going to get to after I say one more thing, it's different because they're not, they're adding clauses. They're not amending clauses. With the Education Act, they're changing some language, which is giving more power to the minister. With the post-secondary changes, they're proposing sections that would allow them to do certain things, and that language is being proposed in this bill at this moment. So the last thing I wanted to just say about the Education Act is under a section that says matters of public interest. Now, this has come up a number of times in critiques and concerns being raised about Bill 33, because we don't know what public interest actually means. And so they have actually said, the matters of public interest will be this, and I'm just going to read it because so it says matters of public interest, it's number 230. I don't know if anybody has ever read the Education Act. It's like a 300 and some odd page document, so it's massive. So we're at line 230. Section 1. For the purpose of this part, the following are matters of public interest. 1, whether boards, board members, and directors of education are carrying out their duties under this act in an appropriate manner. And 2, any other matter that may be prescribed. And that's, again, a moment where we realize vague language feels cool, but opens up a door for we don't know what yet. It may be any other matter that may be prescribed. So public interest is whatever the minister decides is public interest. But public interest could also be if you find a way to get to the minister, maybe they agree with you, and now that becomes public interest. But what if you have an issue like, I don't know, school resource officers, and you've decided that that's a problem and that it's a matter of public interest, but the minister doesn't agree with you? Then what happens? If the minister doesn't prescribe it as public interest, then it doesn't get taken up as public interest. And with that, I want to shift us into what I think is the ripple in the post-secondary campus. So with Schedule 3 for the post-secondary sector, there's so many pages. I'm just letting you know. There are a lot of pages to what happened to the Education Act or what they're proposing, and people should pay close attention, but those were just my highlights. You have to guess what's happening. Past behavior, so one of the questions in the room was, like, until the debate is happening, we have to take a guess as to what it could mean. Past behavior is one, past decisions is another, and for post-secondary, it's a prime example of past legislation as well. So Bill 33 in second reading is coming after Bill 166, which also dictated a bunch of things for post-secondary. So I'm gonna bring some stuff together, but let's start slowly. Let's be gentle. I'm just gonna change my little slide here. There we go. Okay, so for Schedule 3, I'm at the University of Waterloo right now, and the student association here, the students union here, had put out a video where they were talking about issues inside Bill 33 around student fees. And before I actually get into those issues, I just wanted to remind people about past behavior, and thank you for raising that, because this is another example. November 2019, there was something called the Student Choice Initiative, and Ontario's Student Choice Initiative allowed students to opt out of paying for some ancillary fees, but it was deemed unlawful. It was deemed unlawful by Ontario divisional courts for two big reasons. One was because it went beyond the government's authority, and two was because it violated university autonomy. Those were the two main reasons why the Student Choice Initiative was struck down. At the time, students' unions across the province celebrated a win because they put a lot of time, energy, effort, and heart into trying to tell students why this was a problem. Because on the surface, the notion of student choice sounds good. Students should have choice. What people didn't realize or understand was how a lot of the services that they request and need and are literally asking the same entity for are actually being funded. So a lot of your mental health services are coming from students' union, the way that they're budgeting their fees. A lot of food hampers, food banks, things like that they're being provided to you in different ways. Depending on the university that you're at, some of the student fees are going to student organizations that are supporting the equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives that are happening at your school. They are usually stepping in and filling a gap that exists because the government proper is not funding something that's needed on the ground. While it was a win, let's all take a deep breath and change the slide. Okay. On the screen, because I want to try and keep us positive, I have interventions that have happened to date. However, there have been some issues, and I'm going to read through some of these issues. One of the things that they have done, actually, I'm just going to, sorry, folks, pretend this didn't happen. Yeah, no, it's okay. Okay, so one of the things that has happened is that they want to add a section. One of the sections that they want to add, they've made it very clear in Bill 33 for post-secondary that they want to add this for every university or college across the province. There is no exception. If there is an exception, they'll have to deal with that some other way. So this is the goal. The title is Admissions Merit-Based. Every college or university referred to in this section shall A, ensure that when assessing applicants for the purpose of admissions into programs of study, assessment is based on the merit of the individual applicant. And B, publish in a manner accessible to the public the criteria and process to be used by the college or university in assessing applicants for admission into each program of study. At this current point in history, if you've been watching anything happening across the border, there are discussions about what merit-based means and what the impact is when merit is ascribed in particular ways. And one of the impacts that we've seen is that many people of color, Black, Indigenous, other racialized folks don't get into programs, women don't get into certain programs, folks with disabilities don't get into certain programs, because many of those programs are supported under our human rights code. Now, in the States, we're seeing a lot of pushback because funding is being withheld from certain institutions, like the historic Black colleges, for instance, are fighting to make sure that they receive the funding that they need. And universities are under threat. If they don't stop doing equity work, they aren't going to get federal funding, et cetera. So there's questions about whether we're really talking about merit or we're talking about potentially discriminatory practices. The Human Rights Commission in Ontario has actually provided some recommendations to the government just based on the bill itself, suggesting that the government remember two big things. One, something called substantive equality. That means making sure that people get what they need to be able to thrive, as opposed to what everybody getting exactly the same thing. That's, yeah. So when we talk about, sometimes the other way we talk about it is like equity versus equality. So equity is you get what you need so everybody can get to a place. Equality is everybody gets exactly the same thing, right? So with the Human Rights Commission, they're talking about, like, don't forget that. And they're also pointing to something called special programs. Special programs are programs that are created using the Human Rights Code as a guide to address gaps in representation, for instance, in our campuses. So if you know that the university has an underrepresentation of Indigenous students, you may create a special program to get Indigenous students to come here. And it might be something like we're waiving tuition, which we've actually heard of programs like that in some institutions. Those programs may not be considered based on merit. Those would be considered special programs that are protected by the Human Rights Code because there's a gap based on data that's being collected that we're trying to address. So now there's questions about all of this emphasis on merit-based entrance into university. What is that going to mean for the equity-focused programs that we have created to ensure that we actually deal with an underrepresentation? And I want to be very clear. I'm going to say it louder for the people in the back. Underrepresentation of particular groups on university and college campuses is not because of those groups. It's because of systemic inequities that don't allow people to get into those spaces. And if we start to mess with that and say, no, they aren't allowed to be here, then we're actually doing things that are discriminatory. That, my friends, is my humble opinion. So the other piece that's in here under the amendments for the Ministry of Training, Colleges and Universities Act, they want to make sure that they're specifying criteria that must or that may not be considered in assessing the merit of an applicant. I'm going to read that once more. So the minister is saying, or in this language, the under regulations, it would now be the government that determines what the criteria is to decide what it is that's considered merit, because they would have the power to amend whatever the university says. So the language, I'm just going to read it as it is. It says, the lieutenant governor and council may make regulations governing the criteria and process to be used by every college or university referred to in this subsection. So they can decide what merit means. They can also decide and specify, for the purpose of the clause, information that must be published and the manner in which it must be published. And then they can decide on what exceptions are to the rule. So there's a clause that allows us to do equity work if we feel so inclined, but there's also clauses that suggest that if we don't feel like doing equity work, we can also do that. My humble opinion, once again, is that we should always be safeguarding equity and inclusion, and we should be following the Human Rights Code. And if the Human Rights Commission is coming out and saying, yo, step back, you're forgetting some stuff, then I tend to feel worried about how much leeway is going into emphasizing merit when there's a history of knowing that merit-based decisions have never really been about merit. They've been about a whole ton of other things that nobody wants to talk about. The second section that's in here is under a title, Development and Implementation of Plan. It says, every college or university described in subsection 1 shall develop and implement a research security plan to safeguard and mitigate the risk of harm safeguard and mitigate the risk of harm to or interference with its research activities. Again, on the surface, who cares? That sounds great. We should always safeguard the things. And then it continues. Minister's directive. The minister may, from time to time, in a directive issued to one or more college or university described in subsection 1, A, specify the date by which a college or university's research security plan can be developed and implemented. B, specify the date by which a plan must be provided to the minister under subsection 4 and any requirements related to updating or revising the plan. And C, which is my favorite, specify topics to be addressed or elements to be included in a plan and the date by which they must be addressed. Now, if the minister's office is the one who makes the determination about what the specific topic should be within a research plan to safeguard the plan and safeguard the interests, we are in a position where they decide the values and the focus and what's allowed and not allowed and what should be researched and what should not be researched. We are doing something that parallels what's happening in the United States of America, and we're pretending like it's only happening over there. Like anti-EDI stuff that's happening over there. We're saying it in a kinder and gentle way because we're saying the minister may from time to time, except we don't know what time it is. And if you look at what they'd wanted to put in already with the merit-based stuff, I think we can take a wild guess as to what it is that's going to go into these things and what's not.
Also, it's weird, like security and that's first one, like you want
Yeah.
like physical security, but no, it's like I think you need integrity.
So
But even then,
in the room, in the room, there's a conversation now about what this word security means. And the interesting thing is that I had in one of my notes,
they want to guide the research of institutions
yeah.
to do what they want, and that's like that's not.
So we have a minister for post-secondary who I referenced before. The minister is the Honorable Nolan Quinn, and that's the Minister of Colleges and Universities. But I don't think people realize that in 2024, I think it was 24, the ministry got a new name. And the ministry is now Ministry of Colleges, Universities, Research Excellence, and Security. And I also was like, security? Cool. And I had questions because I'm that girl. But now when you look at these amendments, you start to understand, well, what they mean by security may be different than what we mean by security. The reality, though, is that because they're saying that they can use a ministerial directive, kind of doesn't matter unless we start to make a fuss and say we're watching. What the minister can do, they are giving themselves a whole ton of control over these kinds of priorities. And if we're having conversations, remember where I started with 2019 and the what was it called? I'm going to have to go backwards now. The Student Choice Initiative. And the Student Choice Initiative being unlawful because it messed with university and college autonomy. We're kind of back where we started, but this time it will be in a piece of legislation, which means they can do whatever they want. There's two sections, and then I promise I open it up for questions, comments, thoughts, hugs, whatever we need. The third piece is written as such. Without limiting the generality of subsection 1, which is the beginning of this thing, a regulation made under that subsection may A, specify which fees may or may not be charged to students or required of students to pay by a college or university, including fees that students may only be charged or required to pay if they are refunded at the student's request. I don't know if you're out there feeling like, this sounds very familiar. B, require a college or university to publish and make available to the public prescribed information about the fees referred to in Clause A, and prescribe the manner in which the information must be published and made available to the public. And C, govern the manner in which the fees referred to in Clause A are charged or refunded. Now, I could be hazarding a guess, but it seems to me that what was struck down originally and deemed unlawful is being inscribed into law. And so now when it goes into this piece of legislation, what happens? That was a lot of hard work that the student unions put into, and a lot of the allies around put into trying to bring attention to what was happening with the Student Choice Initiative. And now while it's being put in a new way, I wonder if people are going to understand that we're having the same fight again. So I just want to say, I feel like it's the Twilight Zone, Groundhog Day for those that are older out there. I feel like we've been here before for those that are wondering what I'm really saying. The last thing that I want to point to is this. It may be my favorite part of all of these amendments. Under conflict, it says, this act or the regulation made under it prevails to the extent of the conflict. Let me go back so you can understand where this conflict may come from. It says, and this is paragraph 24, if a provision in this act or in a regulation made under this act conflicts or is inconsistent with any other act or regulation, and now let's say it all together, this act or the regulation made under it prevails to the extent of the conflict.
So that means if it's in conflict with the previous.
That means if it's in conflict with a previous piece of legislation, ruling, etc., this is the one that rules. So, my friends, we've had, so at this point, here are some interventions that we've seen. When it comes to the amendments to the Education Act, which is kindergarten to grade 12, the OHRC raised concerns about the reintroduction of the SRO program. At FO, so the Education Teacher Federation of Ontario, they raised concerns at FO about the overreach or power grab, board takeovers, dismissal of an entire layer of elected government, or the things like the school board trustees. Since tabling this this bill, the minister has been in various news spaces and said that he doesn't even think that we need to have school board trustees. And so there's he did say there'd be another piece of legislation that will be coming out. And that will come out by the end of the year is what he said. So if he follows through, we have to keep a close eye. And if you believe me around these ripples, because how else are we going to know what's happening but past behavior and future behavior, then I worry about what's happening there and the impact it will have in the post-secondary sector. When it comes to amendments to the Ministry of Training, Colleges and Universities Act, the OHRC has raised concerns about this bill. And again, as I said before, substantive equality principles and special programs were the goal. I need to say this before I open it up for questions, and by all means, if you're watching the live stream, throw in comments and such. Bill 166, called Strengthening Accountability and Student Supports Act 2024, which is law, required a whole ton of things that on the surface also appeared awesome. What did they ask for? For both mental health and for equity focused initiatives, they wanted the universities and colleges to submit an overview of their equity policies and their mental health policies, and everything should have been glorious. However, when the bill became law, and it happened pretty quickly, they had a very tight deadline to get everything into the minister's office. And there was a clause that also said the minister is authorized to issue directives in relation to the information to be provided about the costs associated with attendance at the college or university, which is fine. There was also something that said we can use ministerial directives and we can kind of do whatever we want anyway. And so as a consequence, yes, every university and college, to my knowledge, complied and did the thing and sent the stuff in. But what wasn't required was that the areas that actually were experts in mental health and equity, that they were the ones providing that information. So oftentimes when the minister's office or when the government says, I need this information, if they don't specify that the information come from people that are experts, then we don't even know what's being sent to them. We don't even know what they're working with. And then everybody is making rules and decisions around things that are impacting students in this sector in very, very real ways. I wish that I could read a piece of legislation that would include a clause that would say, let us be led by experts in this area. But maybe that's just me. I also want to point to Bill 67. Bill 67 was a bill that I had tabled called the Racial Equity in the Education Systems Act. The reason I'm raising this, and it got retabled as Bill 16, the reason I'm raising this is that it is an example of a piece of legislation that does something very similar in that it goes into the Education Act, into the ministry, like the post-secondary legislation. It proposes a ton of amendments with the goal of embedding equity in a tangible way. I put in things like wanting to make sure that if you're in charge of equity stuff, you had the resources to be able to do it, that you got the training, that you became an expert in this area. And if you weren't an expert in the area, that you spoke to experts in the area. When that bill was tabled for about 3 days, life was awesome. The government actually supported the bill. We sent it to committee. Only one person voted against it. So it was a pretty interesting moment in history. And about 3 days later, people hated everything about the bill. People were very, very mad at me for putting this through. They were upset about critical race theory. They were upset about equity being put at the forefront. I was inundated with hate. My office had to close at both Queen's Park and in community because of the amount of aggression that we were receiving on a daily basis. Like, it was bonkers. I tell you that to tell you this. When you fight for equity using the tools of the state, people don't like it. But apparently, when you fight for things that can open up the doors to inequity, we seem to be okay with it. I would like everybody who's watching this to prove me wrong, to actually take a look at the piece of legislation, Bill 33, to think through what this could mean, and to take part in building a democratic system that actually works for us. And that means using every single opportunity that you have to raise your voice, to explain where your concerns are, and to find a way to make change inside the system. I want you folks to know that I have this TV show called Everyday Politics with Laura May Lindo, and the first 3 or 4 episodes have been about Bill 33. So you can actually take a look at that show. I met with students to talk about the amendments that are being proposed. I had the president of ETFO in Waterloo Region on with me to talk about Bill 33. I think this week was the episode where I had an assistant deputy minister of education who has since retired, who also spoke to me about Bill 33. I'm talking to as many people as I possibly can and making sure that those resources are available. But most importantly, I include resources on the actual site, and I'm putting them here for you as well. I'll make sure if anybody wants this PowerPoint, I will give it to anybody who wants it. There are links to understanding from K to 12, why the school resource officer is being questioned right now, conversations about where investment should go, like how about fixing our schools so that students can go to school and not have to wear 5,000 layers because there's no heat in their school. That would be something that I would love to see the government invest in. I also have resources for post-secondary education. That includes getting linked to the minister's websites, to another important thing I want to point out, which is the Ontario Regulatory Registry. Apparently, even if this becomes law, you can actually sign up to find out when regulatory changes are happening and write in comments and feedback to the bureaucratic side of the government about what your concerns are, so that they can take that into consideration when they try to put these regulations into practice. So for those that don't know, legislation is a vision, regulations put it into practice. So even if this becomes law, and a lot of people get overwhelmed with the idea that, oh my gosh, it's going to become law and now this is the end of the world, there are still opportunities for you to participate in building something better from whatever we're given. And those are in those spaces when the regulations happen. You can start pushing back in those moments.
Regulations done by civil servants who are supposed to be
Yes. So the regulations are nonpartisan folks that are on the bureaucratic. These are part of the Ontario Public Service, and they're the ones that are putting this all into practice. And so from their perspective, no matter who is in government, and they don't get fired, and some might get fired, I don't know, but I'm just saying that it's not like because a new government comes in, they fire all of those folks. There are many people who are working in these ministries who have been working under the Liberals, under the Conservatives, under the Liberals, under the NDP when that happened, under the Liberals and the Conservatives, all these different things. And so some of those folks have the history and will understand when you start to raise concerns that you have. And so I want us to make sure that we plug in to as many of these places as we possibly can. And with that, my friends, I leave this slide up for those that are on the live stream so you know how to find me. That's my email address at the University of Waterloo. You can find me on social. It's all my name. It's very simple. And I'd be more than happy to talk to folks about Bill 33, my thoughts, opinions, and all of those fine things. Yay!
How many people are on the live stream?
I don't even know. I can't actually see any of this stuff right now. But yeah.
When was it?
Bill 33 was introduced on May 29th, 2025. Very, very, very recent. And they would have, sorry? So it's in second reading. So on May 29th, 2025, they tabled it. They went through, the first reading is literally you just put it down and say, hey, I like this bill. It's a good title. Everybody just says, sure, whatever. Then the second reading is when the debates start. So the debates have begun about the bill, but there's never, while there's time where you can go, when they tell you that it's time for the community consultations to happen, you can go to Queen's Park and you can participate in that. But there's never a time where you can't tell somebody how you feel. You could write letters right now. You could literally start a letter writing campaign and raise your concerns. Technically, do what the OHRC did. They put in submissions. They weren't waiting for anything. They just put out their letter. They wrote the letter to the minister. They were like, hey, I'm concerned about this. Please remember. And they put down a history of things to demonstrate those concerns. So anybody can participate in that. And in fact, another way that you can participate is with things like this. This is a wee petition, my friends. It's for Stop Bill 33. And this petition reads as follows. To the Legislative Assembly of Ontario, whereas decades of chronic underfunding of post-secondary education in Ontario has created a crisis in the sector, forcing Ontario colleges and universities to cut programs, reduce student supports and services, close campuses, and lay off thousands of staff and faculty. And whereas the Ford government provides the lowest per student funding in Canada and made an additional $1.2 billion cut to post-secondary funding in its latest budget, and whereas an estimated 80,000 additional spots will be needed in Ontario universities in the next 5 years to meet the growing demand from qualified domestic students, and whereas Bill 33 distracts from the funding crisis by centralizing government control over student fees and admissions and imposing unnecessary costly red tape and bureaucracy, and whereas student ancillary fees support the delivery of vital student services such as food banks, campus safety initiatives, student mental health supports, and whereas post-secondary admission processes are already transparent and accountable, designed to ensure that all students meet academic qualifications and prevent the exclusion of qualified students because of unfair barriers. Therefore, we, the undersigned, petition the Legislative Assembly of Ontario to call on the government to withdraw Bill 33 and instead provide Ontario colleges and universities with the financial stability and sustainability they urgently require to meet enrollment demand and advance Ontario's economic, social, and cultural well-being. And if I was still a member of provincial parliament, I would say, I completely support this petition, affix my name to it, and send it to the clerk. So, in order for us to table petitions at Queen's Park, we need original signatures. So that means grabbing a copy of this, getting a handful of people to sign it, and then you can send that to your closest MPP's office. I'm going to take a gander that if your closest MPP is a government member, that they aren't going to look so fondly upon your petition, but you can definitely find an official opposition member or one of the other independent members to table your petition. If you're out in my neck of the woods, then I can help you to be connected with the MPPs that are here, and we can take it from there. This is our democracy. What they do at Queen's Park, they're doing at our house. And we've got to make sure that no matter what they do, no matter what they say, we don't act from a place of fear, but instead we act from a place of love, care, and compassion for each other. Folks, I'm signing off on this live stream. I hope that you have enjoyed. Please spread the word. And if you have any questions, reach out.
So first reading is when they